Hi everyone. So today we are going to deal with water ion balance in insects. Insects live in a variety of environments which comes from freshwater to deserts, and they must maintain an osmotic balance to survive. This involves the regulation of water content and ions in their body fluids. Insects have an open circulatory system and they lack specialized kidneys, and they have mastogen tubules and hindgut and cuticles for maintaining this water ion balance. Ions. Inorganic ions other than potassium and sodium commonly diffuses into the urine transcellularly because active or passive transport. In the adult Melophilies, the movement of the most anions occurs in inverse proportion to their hydration, which means that these anions get dissolved in water and are attracted by more water molecules, which forms an hydration shell. The higher the water molecules are attracted to the anions, it becomes heavier and the movement across the membrane becomes slower. However, some of the ions are actively transported, and these have been true for the phosphate in Caraceus and sulfate in Schistothera. Chloride generally follows the active transport of sodium or potassium to maintain the electroneutrality and ensures the charge balance in the insects. In the case of terrestrial insects, the urine production is depending on the active movement of potassium or sodium into the mastogen tubules, which has been followed by the passive movement of anions, which has been told earlier, which maintains the electrical neutrality. The insects cannot normally sustain a high loss of ions from their hemolymph, and when the loss occurs, they are recovered by reabsorption through the fluid. The active reabsorption of chloride and sodium occurs in the ileum and rectum. In Caraceus, about 95% of the sodium and 80% of potassium in the urine, primary urine, are being reabsorbed. In some other insects, most or all of the reabsorptions occurs in the mastogen tubule. The potassium chloride and water absorption occurs in the lower proximal region of the tubules of Rodnius. Some useful organic compounds are recovered from primary urine, and mastogen tubules actively reabsorb the glucose. Now the ion absorption in freshwater insects. Freshwater insects tend to lose salt to the environmental conditions because of their high permeable cuticle. Potassium, sodium, chloride are being reabsorbed in the rectum. As a result, the rectal fluid is being hypotonic to the hemolymph. Salts are being gained from the food, but also it is being gained from the chloride cells through the environment. Salts are also taken up by the rectal gills of the larval Anisoptera and the rectal chloride epithelium of Psychoptera. The inorganic ions in the environment causes larval Psychoptera to pump water in and out of the rectum, which is in respiratory purposes in Anisopteran larvae. This supplies water potentially containing ions to the chloride epithelium in the region of rectum. Freshwater insects are able to regulate the composition and the osmotic pressure of hemolymph over a range of conditions to which they are normally subjected. The hypotonic medium regulation breaks down and the hemolymph rapidly becomes isotonic with the surrounding medium. These insects are apparently unable to produce a fluid in the rectum which is hypertonic to the hemolymph condition. The aquatic insects live in habitats which is salinity. Aedes detritus, for example, occurs in salt marshes, and the Coelopa frigida breeds in seaweed washed area. In both situations, salinity varies according to the degree of desiccation and their inundation. These insects regulate ionic composition of their hemolymph and maintains the osmotic pressure. Insects living in a freshwater gain water and salt with their diet and loses water osmotically. And their salt ingestion can be limited by selecting food of the lowest available salinity. In the reabsorption occurring in the saltwater mosquitoes is in the rectum part. Sodium, potassium, magnesium and chloride ions are secreted into the posterior rectum to create a hypertonic fluid condition. Saltwater insects get rid of the excess ions by excreting urine, which is hypertonic to the hemolymph. Osmolarity of the urine produced, which is in the posterior rectum, is proportional to that of the medium. The posterior rectum is responsible for water and the ion reabsorption. In hypertonic condition, where water gain is more is a main issue, the posterior rectum remains inactive, which prevents the excessive ion retention and reduces water absorption. This ensures excess water is effectively eliminated instead of being reabsorbed. By this, the osmotic pressure is being regulated. A larvae which lives in water with a high concentration of sodium chloride actively secretes sodium and chloride ions into the posterior part of the rectum to maintain the balance. If bicarbonate is the dominant anion in that medium and it is secreted into the rectum. In the case of sulfate, it is secreted into the Malpighian tubule. Water balance. The water content of different insects is been in different ranges, which is being compared to their body weight. And it has been 60 to 80% of their body weight in some, and it can be also as low as 40%. Water balance means the gain or loss of the water in the insects. Water is normally obtained with the food, by drinking and by metabolic water. When the external water is not available, the metabolic water is the major source for the insects. Terrestrial insects loses water by the process of evaporation to their body surface, or it can be by respiratory surface as well as in the urine. If they are to survive, these losses must be kept equal with the gain of water from other sources. Most of the water is gained into the insect from the food source, and when they are deprived of food, water is available through their metabolic water. In the terrestrial insect, water is lost by the evaporation across the integuments. This reduced by the presence of wax layer in the epicuticle. This water loss can be decreased by the wax layer in this epicuticle. And it can be also lost through the respiration through the spiracles and during the excretion time. This cuticular permeability for the loss of water has been varying greatly between the insects, which has been depending upon their lifestyle and habitat. The water loss from insect's cuticle varies with temperature and also with the humidity of the air. Many species, the rate of water loss increases at temperatures well above the normal environmental temperatures, which is greater than the environmental temperature. It may also be due to the melting of the wax on the surface of the cuticle, the water loss. And it has been water loss is being limited by the high humidity of the adjacent air. The water loss is being restricted by the presence of epicuticular lipids in their cuticle, which is being a thick layer of wax. These insects with the cuticles which are impermeable have a high quantities of wax so that water loss can be prevented. Taking example of the Diapos pupae of Manduca, which has a greater quantity of cuticular wax than the non-Diapos pupae, which helps to reduce the water loss. Here the Diapos pupae having greater quantities of cuticular wax, which reduces the water loss than the non-Diapos. And there is also much thick layer of wax in the surface of the desert beetles during the summer season, which reduces the water loss. And which is being compared to the winter beetles, which is having less wax. This specific composition of wax is also important for the water loss of insects. Now comes the water loss through the respiratory surfaces. Respiratory surfaces are being permeable, and this leads to water loss. Respiratory surfaces also have invagination of tracheae and spiracles, which can limit this water loss. When the spiracles are being open, the water loss has been very high, and it can lead to increased water loss. When there is a high metabolic rate in insects due to the temperature increase or by any activities, the spiracle opening is necessary to exchange the respiratory gases. So there also can be a leading factor to the water loss. More prolonged and frequent spiracle opening results in water loss. Spiracle opening becomes important during slide. When spiracles are being continuously opened, the water loss chances also being high. The Schistosura, water loss at 30 degrees Celsius and 60% humidity increases. And the loss to these spiracles take parts a lot, but all of it can't be through this. Discontinuous ventilation is considered an adaptation to limit these water loss. But this is not supported in any thesis of recent times, but it can be an alternative model of reducing the water loss. Water loss through excretion. An insect produces nitrogenous excreta to remove their waste products. By removing these, water also being removed. Reabsorption occurs to concentrate the water to prevent the water loss. These insects can regulate these water by reabsorption processes. Taking an example of locust, which feeds on wet food produces 90% of water content, and it can be reduced to 25% when it is being feeding on dry food. When this water shortage occurs, insects probably reabsorbs as much as 95% of water through their primary urine. The fluid feeding insects, which has been examples, blood feeding and fat feeding insects, can consume a large amount of liquid, which is being processed efficiently to avoid overhydration and to maintain the ion balance. To prevent this dilution of their hemolymph, these insects have a mechanism to eliminate these excessive produced water rapidly. Some discontinuous feeders, such as Rhodinius, take large meals at a time. After this large meal, the excess water must be reduced to reduce their body weight so that they can move easily. And also to prevent the dilution of hemolymph. The other example is Glossina, which is the blood-feeding insects. After feeding, they excrete a large portion of their ingested water. And in phloem and xylem feeding bugs, their structure of alimentary canal has been modified such that instead of absorbing water into their hemolymph, it is directly being diverted from anterior of the midgut to their hindgut, so that excretion can take place very quickly without entering into the hemolymph.